I'm going to be joining you on Twitter shortly. You're probably just hearing my disembodied voice, but I will be on in just a moment. Hi on Facebook. Hi on Instagram. Sorry if you see the light circulating in my eyes. It's obviously my lamp, right? I need it for the light. Let me know if you can't hear me. You should probably be able to hear me. My mic says it's working, I believe. Yeah, let me know if you have any issues with hearing me. I'm going to just check real fast myself. Thanks for joining me today. As you can see on Twitter, I'm just making sure that you can hear me. Just going to double check. Sure. Yeah, you can hear me on Twitter. Great. So as you can see on Twitter, there is a hashtag that is trending called Restore the Vote. And it has to do with the fact that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was gutted in 2013. And we're about to go into redistricting without the protections of the Voting Rights Act, the full protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And that is highly problematic. So I kind of want to give you all a little bit of an update about what's happening with voting rights right now. And unfortunately, it's not a lot. Unfortunately, I would love to say that there is more going on with voting rights right now. But what we're trying to do, what everyone's trying to do, is try to bring attention to the issue of voting rights. And I'm also going to say that that means we all need to be bringing attention to the issue of voting rights and voter suppression right now, because the main goals for a lot of the Republican-run state houses across the United States is that they're going to be gerrymandering their districts. It seems a little hypocritical for me to say that, knowing that in New York, we're going to be doing something similar. Like we'll be able to eliminate a few Republican-held districts in New York State. And to me, unfortunately, I guess it's a kind of a what's good for the goose is good. What's good for the goose is good for the gander at this point, because Republicans are going to go full steam with trying to redistrict these in a way that dilutes Black people's votes and Latino people's votes and Asian votes and everything. It's trying to get rid of our power in voting. It won't be one person, no vote, as Dr. Carol Anderson said. It will be one person, no vote, as she wrote in her book. And that's why right now this is the time to really kind of pull the it is time right now to pull the lever of panic, because we're going into this redistricting phase without the protections of the Voting Rights Act. And that's huge. But right now we have two bills ready to go for the PEOPLE Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And both of these acts, if they were passed, would protect us. It would protect us from racial gerrymandering in that way, partisan gerrymandering in that way. It would help us right now. And so that's what I'm trying to bring attention to. So one of the things that I would love to do right now is read something that Kristen Clark, she is the Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice. She testified in front of the House Judiciary Committee yesterday to really talk about the urgency of what is needed to pass these voting rights acts. And the reason that it is urgent is that if you have a bill that is passed right now, it is going to be harder to go back and try to dismantle a voter suppressive act. It's going to be harder to dismantle that at this moment. And not only that, but I want people to understand this. It is very difficult to try to block one voter suppression thing at a time. And that is why we need to restore the Voting Rights Act. I want you all to know that I believe it was from 1965 to 2013, before the Voting Rights Act was gutted, there were over 3,000 voting changes that states tried to make that would have suppressed the vote, that were blocked by the DOJ because the Voting Rights Act was intact. It is very hard to dismiss 3,000 3,000 voter changes now. Each one has to be addressed one at a time. Do you see? This is why we need the protection of the Voting Rights Act, so we can so we can block, so we can protect our right to vote. Okay. So I want to read something that Kristen Clark, this is part of her testimony for yesterday. No, I'm not going to read all 20 pages. In fact, I'm just going to read 2 of the pages. But I think it's important to know why she is so passionate about voting rights, why I am so passionate about voting rights, and really explains what happened. So I'm just going to read 2 pages. Okay, this is from Kristen Clark's testimony yesterday. And it was entitled Oversight of the Voting Rights Act, Potential Legislative Reforms. Okay, let me just double check something, because I'm getting a few comments. Okay, here we go. The Voting Rights Act truly is, as President Johnson said when he signed it into law, one of the most monumental laws in the entire history of American freedom. It reflected bold action by Congress when bold action was needed to confront the fact that nearly a century after Reconstruction amendments, millions of citizens were still denied the ability to register, to vote, and to participate fully in American democracy because of their race. The Act's most innovative provisions, for example, the appointment of federal examiners to put people on the rolls in recalcitrant jurisdictions, and the pre-clearance provision that prevented jurisdictions from adopting new provisions that would roll back hard-fought gains. This transformed American democracy. In the South, more Black voters were added to the rolls in 2 years following the passage of the Voting Rights Act than in the previous century. And in places from South Carolina to South Dakota, from Alabama to Alaska, minority voters, Black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, and Alaskan Natives, elected officials who use government as a mechanism to make all of our lives better. Because when recalcitrant districts tried to get around new gains with new tactics, pre-clearance blocked them from doing so. I'm going to keep reading it, but I want to explain that pre-clearance was in the Voting Rights Act, and that pre-clearance meant you had to ask for permission before you could change voting, before you could close down polling locations, before you could institute a voter ID law. You had to ask the DOJ, and it had to get clearance from that, right? Okay. The issues, I'm going back to what Kristen Clark said yesterday. The issues of fairness and democracy we face today are different, but equally pressing. If the end of the 20th century was a period of dramatic expansion in voting rights, the 21st century has so far been a period of rising attacks on voting rights. We have seen cutbacks to early voting periods, imposition of additional requirements to cast ballots, either at polling places or with respect to absentee ballots, and new restrictions on the right of civic groups to assist citizens in participating fully in the electoral process. And this is senior citizens from voting or disabled voters. There's blockages on that right now, or also Native people who live in rural areas from collecting ballots and delivering them to their polling place. Okay. Congressional action is necessary. Congressional action is necessary to prevent us from backsliding into a nation where millions of citizens, particularly citizens of color, find it difficult to register, to cast their ballot, and to elect candidates of their choice to offices from the president to members of the local school board. And I want people to understand that really quickly. There are over 500,000 elected seats throughout the entire United States. And when we are blocking people from voting, we are preventing everything from people who serve on zoning, to people who are on school boards, to people who are in Congress, to people who are at the state or local level, city council. It affects everything. A lot of people seem to think when we are blocking voting rights, when we are disenfranchising people, it just affects Congress. No, it does not. It trickles down everywhere. And it means that power is unequal, right? And we know this. We have proof of this. The 2020 census numbers show that the United States is an increasingly diverse nation. This raises profound questions about how the next redistricting will be conducted, including whether the officials who draw congressional and legislative maps and decide districts for city council and county commissions draw districts that are fair to all voters. Okay? And that's another thing. The census came out and we see that our country got more diverse. We knew that was happening. That was always happening. That was the trajectory of it. And we also know that more diversity means more panic with the Republicans. It shouldn't, because they could come up with policy that appeal to their voters, to all voters, and they're choosing not to. Instead of coming up with better policy, they are deciding that they cannot win on what they stand for. So what they're going to do instead is block our vote, okay? This round of redistricting is the first since the Supreme Court's 2013 decision in Shelby County versus Holder. Severely cut back on the protections of the Voting Rights Act provided. It is now time for Congress to respond by developing legislation that responds to our current situation with respect to redistricting and otherwise, a situation in which voting rights are under pressure to an extent that has not been seen since the civil rights era. The department looks forward to working with Congress to craft new voting rights legislation that addresses the problems that we face today. And thinking about what new legislation should do, it is important to understand how we got to this point. So my testimony today, I want to explain the special role the department has played in protecting the right to vote, particularly in the modern era that began with the creation of the Civil Rights Division in 1957. And this is just the last page I'm going to read here. This story provides several important lessons. First, case-by-case challenges to restrictive voting practices are not enough. The sort of litigation is complex, resource intensive, and gives the Supreme Court what memorably is called an advantage of time and inertia to jurisdictions that are using practices that deny citizens an equal opportunity to participate in the political process and elect representatives of their choice. In layman's terms, in more simple terms, what they're saying is you have to have the voting rights protection put in place so that this massive onslaught, this flood of voting rights, this flood of voter suppression, this flood of disenfranchisement, this flood of racial gerrymandering, that this can get blocked by a big piece of legislation. Instead, if you do not have the protections of the Voting Rights Act in place, if you don't have For the People Act, if you do not have John Lewis Voting Rights Act, if you don't restore the VRA, what happens? It means that all of these massive amounts of voter suppression that comes flooding in, one person is standing there with a sword only blocking one at a time. Meanwhile, the rest surge through. Okay, this is the danger. This is the danger of not having the Voting Rights Act in place. This is why Congress adopted the pre-clearance requirement of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and amended and extended that requirement each time with overwhelming bipartisan support in 1970, 1975, 1982, and 2006. 2006, before our first Black president. I wonder why voting rights started becoming dismantled after we elected our first Black president, okay? Second, pre-clearance worked well. Covered jurisdictions, knew that if they could not show that a proposed voting change from moving a polling place to requiring voters to re-register to de-annexing minority neighborhoods to diluting minority voting strength had neither a discriminatory purpose nor a discriminatory effect, the department would block that change. So most jurisdictions decided not to propose new challenges in the first place. But when jurisdictions did try those sorts of discriminatory changes over a half century of pre-clearance was in effect, the department blocked 3,000 different voting suppression proposals. So you can see that one of the great things about having a voting rights law in place, a voting rights act in place, is that there is a preemptive, a preventative measure. it prevents people from saying, listen, I don't want to deal with the DOJ. I don't want to try to even go and push this oppressive law in place. And that is also the beauty of it. Not only does it block voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement, but it also prevents it from being drafted in the first place. Okay. So I can post her whole speech. I'll post her entire speech online because I think it's important for people to see it and for people to read it. What Kristen Clark did. I mean, Kristen Clark really is a champion of voting rights in the United States, and I'm so thankful that she is in the DOJ. But one of the things that I want to mention is that we have this idea that that these people that are doing voting rights that are in Congress or in the DOJ or even myself, that don't worry about it, they'll take care of it. And that's really not how we should be thinking about politics ever, right? The people who do finally get elected to office, they need to be championing these things to make sure they're expanding and strengthening democracy. But they still need the public to care and to push and to make this change happen as well. That's the purpose of activists, and that's the purpose of advocates, and that's the purpose of organizations, civil rights organizations. So all of us in this moment are incredibly needed with voting rights. One of my fears is still that people do not inherently understand the connection to voting rights and every single thing that they care about. I say it every week, and I'm going to continue to say so. If you are worried about the climate crisis, if you are worried about affordable education or free education, if you are worried about affordable or free healthcare, if you are worried about accessibility and transportation, all of that is attached to the fact that we need to be able to go and vote in representatives that actually give a damn about any of those things too. If you do not, and if you cannot vote them in, then the people that are going into office are not going to make those things happen all of a sudden, right? So we need to have access to the ballot box to vote in people that understand that we are in a climate crisis and really bordering on a climate catastrophe. We need to vote in people that understand that we're dealing with a housing crisis. We need to vote in people that understand that even one child in poverty is one child in poverty too many, right? And I believe I mentioned this last week, there's a wonderful representative. She's actually my brother's representative, Lauren Underwood. She said, I'm paraphrasing her. She said, people think that when they vote in someone into Congress, that the people that are in Congress, work on the most important issues of the day. That's not true. The person that you vote in, they're bringing in the issues that they think are the most important of the day. Now think about that. Think about when you vote in people that are incredibly wealthy, that have connections to other incredibly wealthy people, that are maybe grew up in a way that doesn't see poverty or recognize poverty, that doesn't understand gender issues, that they don't really care about trans children being harmed, that they don't really care about unhoused people because they've never dealt with a housing issue. When we're voting in people that have never been food insecure before, if these things are all out of their purview, then we know that we're voting in people that may not prioritize putting those issues in. And so when people say to me, like when I am running for Congress, and they're saying, wow, why do you want to work at that level, at the congressional level? And one of the reasons I want to work at the congressional level is for two reasons. One, I believe that the budget is a moral document. Our federal budget is a moral document. And right now it's a very immoral document. The way that we spend money in our country is not in a moral way. We have let Republicans get away with the narrative, and I'm going to get to narrative creation in a moment. We have let them get away with the narrative creation that money somehow is their money, not our money. And they are really tight about how we get to spend it when they are willing to subsidize banks, their friends, themselves, but not things that are essential, like fully funding public housing, right? So to me, I wanted to go in there and say, we need to talk about this document of the budget and have a new narrative about how we're spending this money, right? And then the second thing is because I recognize that in the district that I live in, and I've lived in Carolyn Maloney's district now for 18 years, on and off for 18 years. I've lived in Greenpoint. I've lived I've lived all over this district in Manhattan. The only part of it that I haven't lived in is Queens, although I have a lot of friends in Queens. I know what the issues are here. I really do. And so that is one of the reasons why I was like, okay, I know at the federal level, these are the things that we can do to immediately alleviate some of the problems that some of the groups and people are having here in New York. And I have exciting ideas and policy ideas, and that's why I wanted to do it. Why not run for city council? Why not run for state assembly? First of all, I'm happy with my city councilwoman. I'm happy with my my state assemblyman and my state senator. I'm not happy with my representative at the federal level. And I haven't been happy for a long time. And the last time, this last election, I did vote for her only because I thought the person that was running against her had the Diet Coke of policy. It was very light policy, and so that's why I was just like, I'm not voting for him. And I also thought he ran a really ageist, borderline sexist campaign. And now, outside of myself and Maloney, who's been in office, the people that are currently running as well, I don't think anyone, honestly, is more qualified than me or understands this community more than me, period. I'm going to say that. Okay. So that is one reason, and those are a couple of reasons that I'm running, and you'll find out more about me as I'm running. So I talked a little bit about voting rights, a little bit of an update about that, a little bit about what Kristen Clark said in her testimony yesterday. But now I want to talk about narrative creation in the media. And one of the reasons why I want to talk about this is because I've seen the media completely botch the entire story about Afghanistan, right? Am I surprised? Absolutely not. First, let me say that I believe in the necessity of media. It is absolutely necessary for us to have a free press. It is necessary that they are safe. It is necessary that they can do investigation. And I firmly believe that we should be fully funding like local papers and to be able to have a bigger voices throughout the United States within media, a diverse body of voices. That's not what's happening right now. Our media, we have a lot of media conglomerates right now. I have long said that we need to dismantle them because right now what's really problematic about them is you can see the same narrative being created throughout, right? We have this perhaps naivete about the media in a way that we think, well, they're giving us the news. They must know what they're talking about, right? And of course, they're well-funded agencies, has a research bureau. Some of them have experts that come on, and that's wonderful. But what I'm talking about are the ones that get a lot of play, and these stories aren't very nuanced. A lot of our media doesn't know how to talk about domestic policy, let alone foreign policy, in a way that is nuanced, that it talks about causality, that it understands, that it really understands cultural differences. There is not a lot of inclusion in that part. And that was one of the things that they were starting to fundamentally get wrong about discussing Afghanistan. A lot of people that I noticed when they were discussing Afghanistan, they were saying, well, this is really surprising that this happened. No, it's not. The Economist did a story about 2 years ago that discussed that if the second that we pull out of Afghanistan, it's going to be a mess. Okay? And I wanted to see that kind of narrative being created in the media, and that wasn't happening. But I want to talk about why the media can do a disservice to us on for several reasons. And I also want to discuss really quickly how the GOP has managed to use the media to really get their talking points through. I think one of the things that really frustrated me about the discussions with Afghanistan was that you saw that a lot of Republicans, they saw it was a great opportunity for them. Even though they were ones that supported us withdrawing for Afghanistan, even though they're the ones that heartily supported us going to war there, now they were like, oh, this is a bad botched thing. And the media immediately went, oh, is it a bad botched thing? Instead of talking about it in a larger, more holistic way. This is because the Republicans have been absolutely excellent at being able to use the media to push through their narratives. And I'm sorry, but Democrats are not as good at doing that. Okay? So let me say one fundamental thing that's essential to narrative creation that Republicans understand. One of the things that's the most essential part of narrative creation is that the story doesn't have to be correct. It just has to be believed. And that is what Republicans are really, really good at. And they have been able to, for a long time, understand that as long as their narrative is just strong enough, it can get repeated in the media. I've studied narrative creation for a very long time. And some of the narratives that I will want to talk about really quickly are, okay, my media people are jumping into my comments here. Something that I want you to understand is Republicans have spent these last 100 years coming up with narrative creation that they have finally perfected, that because it's effective. So we have some of these narratives right now that hurt us with voting. Let me start first with voting. Something that Republicans have done with voting is they have made the media feel as if there are two valid sides to the voting rights issue. There are not two valid sides to the voting rights issue. To block a person's right to vote is dismantling democracy. But the media is framing this story as, well, this is how the Republicans feel, and this is how the Democrats feel. If the media, when they're reporting on other countries, let me use Russia, for example, and they were talking about ballot box stuffing. The media was very clear. This election is fraudulent. And they were very clear about it. And it's because they're talking about another country. But when they're talking about the fact that our country is dealing with Republicans actively trying to dismantle our democracy, dismantle our vote, maintain white male supremacy, they are acting as if, well, we need to give them a platform to talk about their ideas and to talk about what they want to do with this policy. Democrats, well, how do you feel about that? This is ridiculous, and I'm getting tired of it. So the media is an unwitting partner to Republicans and helping with making it seem like voting rights, maybe we do need to look at both sides. That is something that I would like the media to stop. Okay? Another thing that I have found really incredibly frustrating is that the media still has not understood how Republicans have used them. I want to use a couple of examples. I use Newt Gingrich a lot because he was excellent at knowing how to use the media with media creation. And then I want to move to this one. This is Susan Faludi when she wrote a book called Backlash in the 80s. Let me start with Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich wasn't the first person to come up with media and narrative creations, but he was part of one of the people that helped perfect it. He was the one that said, we're going to talk about how we're going to associate this list of words with Democrats and this list of words with Republicans. They would list like freedom with Republicans and welfare with Democrats. He knew that if he kept trying to associate Democrats with illegitimacy, with welfare, that the media would repeat back what Newt said. And he was incredibly successful about it. And that is something that we're still seeing the media do. The Republicans are feeding out their talking points, and the media goes, well, should women have the right to vote? We'll discuss it at 9. Really, they're really discussing it in almost those terms, because what they're saying is, should Black people have the right to vote? Let's debate it at 10. That is how the media is buying into, right? Republicans' talking points, which is so dangerous. But I want you to know that I really want all of us to kind of understand how the Republicans have come up with media creation, and then how we can go through and try to dismantle that media creation. So I want to talk about a little bit of this one, backlash, because this is when in the 80s under Ronald Reagan's administration, when they really figured out how to harm women, do a backlash about the ERA, women's rights, women's equal pay. They were really able to figure out a way, and they used that as a blueprint to hurt the LGBTQ community. They were able to use this now with the trans community, right? But that narrative really was effective in the 1980s. They weren't sure how to do it at first. I want to explain. They realized that their views were extreme. They even said it. One of them even said, we want to be thought of as the radicals. Okay? And then they recognized that they couldn't be thought of in that way. So they had a new linguistic strategy. The new right labeled its resistance to women's newly acquired reproductive rights as pro-life. Right? The word pro-life didn't come into our nomenclature until the 80s. But they knew that this was great. They were really on to something. They were going to be the pro-life party. They were going to be the pro-family party. And the media ate it up. Okay? But really, the party is about anti-rights, anti-choice, anti-women, forced birth. That's really what the Republican Party became in the 1980s. But they were able to rebrand themselves through a linguistic strategy. And really, the Heritage Foundation was a part of that. But one of the things that I really, I thought was quite brilliant was, and this is something I really want people to hear, because there's a horseshoe effect on the left and the right with this. Despite the verbal bravado, the new right was wholly dependent on another movement for its identity. Okay, so I want you to understand this, because this is something that Republicans do, and this is some on the what they call themselves leftists do. Not all leftists, not all Republicans, but mostly, right? They are finding somebody as the enemy. And by the way, this is what fascists do. Yeah, I said it. This is what fascists do. They find an enemy, they create one, and then they form their identity because they're being against it. So we have Republicans who have decided that they're now calling all Democrats radicals, communists, socialists, right? They're saying this. And Democrats are kind of laughing a little bit, thinking, well, those sticks and stones, we don't really think those are a big deal. Republicans know who they're messaging to when they say communists, when they say socialists. I mentioned this last week. Within the Latino community, the Hispanic community is vast and it's big, and there's all different types of belief systems, from religion to political beliefs. But Republicans are specifically messaging to Latinos and Afro-Latinos that were in countries where they felt that socialism and communism financially hurt them and injured their families. That's why they're saying that. I want you to understand there is a reason for the name calling. Republicans don't just make this up. They use their think tanks to come up with messaging that is effective to target people. And by the way, they are targeting some Latinos that have an anti-Blackness streak to them, right? So Republicans know what they're doing when they're going through this type of messaging, okay? And then I want you to understand a few other things that Republicans are doing. They're trying to just meld our entire party together, even though there's clearly Democrats that are in the party that are kind of moderate. They know, and they feel that they can use the extreme left as their main enemy, and to paint the entire party that way, right? And then on the same side, you have some leftists that are calling the enemies the establishment, which is in Congress. And that's why I've got to be honest, I'm confused when Bernie Sanders says the establishment. When you're in Congress for 25 years, you are the establishment. Let me just say that, right? But on the left side, they are saying establishment. They are using that as their way of creating an enemy And it also galvanizes a movement on one side. I just want us to be very aware of why people are creating these narratives and for what reason. Okay. Jeremy said, if the media has stopped taking police reports at face value, why do they still think Republicans take talking points at face value? Because I will say one of the reasons, and I think Jeremy knows this, it's because a lot of media still wants access. And this has been a problem for a really long time. There's a lot of media, and you'll see it with Chuck Todd. I believe Jeremy talked about Chuck Todd. Chuck Todd loves access. They want access to these Republicans to kind of show, listen, we're giving both sides platforms, right? Not really. They keep giving the same people platforms over and over and over and over again. Which I'm going to switch to something else within narrative creation. Let me talk about my candidacy and narrative creation. Okay. So what I find interesting perhaps about my campaign is that the media has no idea how to define me, which by the way, I love and I find incredibly flattering. But when I first declared that I was running for Congress, the first thing that happened to me was there was two papers. I think it was City and State, and I think it was someone from CNN or something like that. And they went through my tweets really quickly to try to figure out how to define me. And they saw one tweet that I said that was critical of AOC. It was during the election, or before the election. I was worried about voting rights, and AOC was doing a live stream, and she was talking about the pink tax, which I think is important. But at that moment, I was like, I really would love for someone like her with a huge platform to be talking about voting rights, right? So the media took that as me being critical towards her. But what the media was really trying to do was find out, am I a leftist? Am I progressive? Am I moderate? Am I for the establishment? And when they couldn't define me in those terms, they didn't know what to do with me. And I'll tell you why. Because the media likes to oversimplify narratives. Oh, it's so painful. By the way, something else that something that is really problematic in our politics and in our media is oversimplifying messages. There's a great documentary on Netflix you all should watch called The Tyrant's Playbook, I believe, something like that, How to Be a Tyrant. And one of the main things that they talk about is oversimplifying messaging is what fascists do, what dictators do, what populists do. They oversimplify messaging so that people can eat it up right away and regurgitate it. It's what Fox News does. Like, remember when you heard everyone saying snowflake, snowflake, the nanny state, the nanny state? That is because Fox News was bringing that down and using that to give to their audience. The audience would repeat it and call people that. That is what simplifying messaging does. It helps create a community of people that are using the same language. Like when people will say Green New Deal, Medicaid for all, Medicare for all, they use the same kind of language. It's to feel bonded in something. It's to use simplified language. The problem with oversimplifying things is that you end up leaving people out. You also end up disappointing the hell out of them, because once people go into politics and they start trying to legislate, they start realizing that it's a lot harder than it is. Someone could say to me, well, Naya, how do you know that? You aren't in office. I understand bureaucracy like the back of my hand, because when my mom and my grandfather died when I was 16, every single semester in college, I had to fill out forms that proved that they were dead. I had to re-show them the death certificate, and I had to re-show them that I didn't know where my father was in order for me to get an aspect of financial aid. Humiliating? Yes. That's part of bureaucracy. That's part of our government is humiliation, right? Humiliation of poor people, humiliation of people without power. Okay. And also making you jump through the hoops of proving yourself. I learned right away that that's how some of our government works. I also learned when I was 16 and I was working with people that were homeless, like some of the hoops that they were dealing with trying to either get into the shelter or trying to get into permanent housing or trying to get out of shelters. I already started, and I was already working with city council in Sarasota. They're not called city council in Sarasota, but I was working with the local leaders in Sarasota. I worked with local leaders in Tallahassee. I worked with local leaders in Atlanta. I have been working with local leaders for 2 decades of my life. Okay. So yes, I understand the process of how all of this works. Again, I want to move back into why the media has had a hard time defining someone like me. And there's several reasons. One is because I'm not a traditional candidate. And for years, the media was very used to having traditional candidates that their parents served in Congress. Or, I met some of these people when my grandfather taught at American universities. When I was a kid, I actually met a lot of politicians when I was a kid. These are people that went to Harvard and to Yale, right? They went to lots of Ivy League schools or bigger schools, and they already knew when they were like 18 that they were going to run for office, right? That was the thing that they were going to do. For myself, I was like, running for office was never something that I wanted to do because I enjoyed the idea. I enjoyed being an advocate. I enjoyed being the person that worked with the activists and worked with the politicians to try to bridge communication to figure out how do we get the needs of the community into policy. I enjoyed that role. That role is a tough role. It's completely thankless, doesn't come with money, and you do it because you're in service of the community. I've been in service of my community for a very long time. So when the media will finally discover me a little bit later on, they're going to recognize a couple of things. This woman knows a lot about policy. She doesn't have a traditional background. She used to be a drummer. She used to be an actor. And now she's doing politician. Now she's a politician. Part of the thing that women, and especially Black women and women of color, what the media has an issue with, is if you don't fit into their box, they're right away going to try to find a way to be demeaning to you and to be rude to you. It doesn't just happen to people like me. Look at Kamala Harris. The media has yet to treat her with a modicum of decency. Not even a little. They are still trashing her every moment they can. And you can see the difference between how they're treating Pete Buttigieg in the cabinet and how they're treating her as vice president of the United States. So our media has lots of issues. Again, I want the media to do well. I want independent media to be well financed and able to function. But I also need to recognize that the media is an unwitting participant in spreading bad narratives and repeating bad narratives of bias, and for them to try to fundamentally always fit people into boxes misses the point of people. You end up doing a bunch of bad things. You end up stereotyping people. You end up missing aspects of the story. And it's only because you don't want to necessarily do the work to actually find out if this person wants to do good by a community. That's something that I would like, and I'm going to leave you all with this. One of the things that I would like to teach the media, and I firmly believe that I have to teach the media this, is that not everybody who runs for office is a garbage person. Right now, the media does these things. The media either falls in love with a candidate and they're just so enamored by them and then tears them apart at a later moment, or they completely question with the most terrible cynicism of why anyone would dare deem to move into a bit of power, right? I want to teach the media this because my goal is not just to win this election, which I intend to do, but I also want to make sure that I encourage other Black women and other women of color and non-binary people and trans people and Native people and disabled people. I want to encourage them to run for office. I want to encourage good people to run for office, because my thing is we need more voices at the table with the experiences of understanding uniquely how this country has harmed our communities, and then changing that through policy, changing it through the legislative process. And I want to challenge the media to stop thinking that every person that decides to walk in to running for office is somehow a terrible person who is just trying to scam people. Because you know why? This discourages good people from stepping into this role. I'm not talking about perfect people because I'm not perfect. I'm talking about people that have always been in service to the community like myself, who now just want to do it in a way that really can affect change. Because right now, just like I'm going to bring this around to Voting Rights Act. Let me do this. I'm going to button it with this. Just like with the Voting Rights Act, with it gone, it can only help one. With it gone, lawyers can only help one group at a time, one case at a time. But when you have the Voting Rights Act passed all the way through, we can block lots of things and help lots of people. Me right now, personally, I can help people. I help people one at a time. There are people that I help that you will never know that I have helped because they have asked privately for my help with either housing issues or job and employment issues or access issues. And I've done that. And I know that's antithetical to a lot of people that run for office, because one of the things that people who run for office always have to do is go, look at my work, look what I have done, look at my great work. Well, a lot of my work is private. I'm helping two people right now try to find two people, right? I'm not going to describe them. I'm helping two people right now find permanent housing. And I've been doing that for years. As my friend Amma said, Maya, you have aided people more than people will ever know. You're just moving into a different capacity now with running for office. And that is why I'm running for office, because I want the chance to do more for more people. I want to do the most good for the most amount of people that I can. Okay? I thank you for your time today. Feel free to donate to my campaign. To learn more about my campaign, you can go to electmaya.com. I always do these talks once a week on Tuesdays, but starting next month, I will start having, you can see my schedule here. It's hectic. Starting next month, I'll have a lot of in-person events, and I would love to see some of your beautiful faces there. Okay? Restore the vote. Enjoy the rest of the day.